Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years. Thousands of guests walked through that curtain, told their jokes, promoted their projects, and were forgotten the moment the credits rolled. Most nights followed a perfect routine setup: punchline, applause, move on. But every once in a while, something went wrong in the best possible way. On those nights, Johnny Carson didn't need a punchline. Sometimes he barely spoke at all, yet the audience couldn't stop laughing. Why did that happen? How could a show designed to control every second of live television suddenly lose control without collapsing? The funniest moments in Tonight Show history weren't always carefully written jokes. They were accidents, awkward silences, risky comments, broken props, and moments when real life spilled onto live television and refused to be pulled back. A guest crossed the line. A joke landed in dangerous silence. The room froze. And instead of rescuing the moment, Johnny Carson did something far more dangerous. He let it happen. Tonight, we're counting down the 15 funniest moments in Johnny Carson history. Not because they were the cleverest jokes, but because they escaped the script, tested the limits of network television, and revealed why Carson wasn't just a host. He was the calm center of chaos. When Don Rickles walked onto The Tonight Show, the room already felt different. Rickles didn't arrive to tell jokes, he arrived to attack. Age, clothes, the desk, even the show itself became targets. On most talk shows, that kind of energy would have been shut down immediately. With Johnny Carson, it was allowed to breathe. The famous cigarette box incident perfectly captured that trust. While Johnny was away, Rickles slammed the box on the desk night after night until it finally broke, not as a planned gag, but as a real accident. The next evening, Carson stormed onto a nearby set and confronted Rickles on camera. For a moment, it didn't feel like television anymore. It felt like real life interrupting the show. That blur was the joke. Carson didn't yell. He didn't escalate. He let the tension hang just long enough for the audience to wonder, is this still a bit, or did something actually go wrong? By refusing to but with timing and restraint. When Rodney Dangerfield sat down on The Tonight Show, he didn't warm up the room. He attacked it. His delivery was fast, nervous, almost panicked, like he was afraid the jokes might escape if he didn't say them immediately. One line barely landed before the next one was already on its way. He opened with his trademark misery. "People drive him crazy," he said. The other night, he asked a bartender for a double, and the bartender brought out some guy who looked just like him. The audience laughed, but Rodney didn't pause. He rolled straight into his marriage. His wife, he explained, wasn't any better. He told her that when he dies, he wants to be cremated. She's already planning a barbecue. That was the line that cracked the room. Johnny Carson lost it. He leaned back, laughing hard enough to lose his balance, and slid right out of his chair. For a moment, the host of the most controlled show on television was on the floor. Rodney kept going. He said he doesn't drink much because he's a bad drinker. When he drinks, the next day he has to do two things: find his car and return the car he took home by mistake. Carson was still laughing, barely able to respond, trying to regain control as the audience exploded. What made the moment legendary wasn't just the jokes. It was that Carson didn't stop it. He didn't jump up to reset the show. He let himself be overwhelmed, letting the audience watch the rare sight of a guest completely overpowering the host and loving every second of it. When Jane Fonda sat across from Johnny Carson, the interview started normally, calm, polite, safe. Then she casually brought up Zsa Gabor, and suddenly the temperature in the room changed. Fonda leaned in and told a story she claimed everyone knew. Zsa, she said, once came on Johnny's show with a cat on her lap and asked him, "Do you want to pet my—" She paused, just long enough for the danger to be obvious. Johnny immediately straightened up. His posture shifted. This wasn't just a joke anymore, it was a test. Fonda pushed again. She asked if it was true that Johnny replied, "I'd love to, if you'd remove that damn cat." The audience already knew the punchline. Everyone knew exactly what the joke meant, but saying it out loud on network television would have crossed the line. Johnny smiled, then shut it down without shutting it down. He calmly said he didn't remember anything like that happening. No wink, no confirmation, just denial. The room laughed anyway, not because the joke was told, but because it wasn't. That was the skill. Carson acknowledged the joke without repeating it, letting the audience finish it in their own heads. He protected the network, protected the show, and still got the laugh. The tension dissolved, and the moment passed not because Johnny avoided the danger, but because he walked straight through it without saying the forbidden words. By the early 1990 seconds, when Don Rickles walked onto The Tonight Show, it wasn't an interview anymore, it was an event. Johnny Carson and Ed McMahon sat back in their chairs, already bracing themselves. Rickles didn't waste time easing in. He went straight for Johnny. He mocked his age, his posture, and the suit he was wearing, asking if Johnny was dressed for summer or auditioning for something he didn't understand anymore. Then Rickles hit harder, snapping that Johnny wasn't gracefully stepping down from the show, he was being asked to leave and pretending it was his idea. The audience gasped, then laughed, waiting to see how far this would go. Rickles turned to Ed next. He asked how Ed was feeling, paused just long enough to sound sincere, then fired again, telling him to keep your name alive while he still could. Ed laughed loudly, leaning into the joke instead of fighting it, acting as the audience's release valve. Johnny barely reacted at all. He stayed still, calm, letting the insults pass without deflecting them. That's when the real tension settled in. The audience stopped listening to the words and started watching Johnny's face. As long as Carson didn't step in, everyone knew the line hadn't been crossed. Rickles pushed, Ed amplified the laughter, and Carson quietly refereed the moment. Three professionals who had done this dance for decades showed exactly how far comedy could go without turning into something real. On a New Year's Eve broadcast, Johnny Carson openly acknowledged the problem facing the show that night. People at home weren't really watching. They were at parties, talking over the TV, treating the program like background noise. So instead of a traditional joke or monologue, Johnny introduced a simple idea: signs. He held up the first card. The message was polite, almost apologetic, a gentle reminder for people at home to pay attention. The audience chuckled. Then he held up another sign. This one was more direct. The joke wasn't the wording itself, but the clear escalation. Each card that followed became more desperate than the last. One sign asked, "Are you still watching?" Another begged viewers not to change the channel. One even claimed that their mother had called and wanted them to watch the show. Johnny didn't sell the joke. He didn't smile or wink. He stood there, deadpan, holding the cards as if reading instructions, letting the awkwardness do the work. Then the bit almost fell apart. One of the cards got stuck and wouldn't slide out properly. Johnny paused, looked down, tried again. Nothing. The silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Finally, the card came free, and the audience erupted. Not because of what the sign said, but because everything that could go wrong did. The laugh came from watching Johnny Carson calmly lose his dignity on live television, one sign at a time, without ever breaking character. During a monologue, Johnny Carson brought up a strange news story about the controversial spiritual leader Bhagwan Rajneesh. Johnny started confidently, explaining that the man owned dozens of Rolls-Royces and somehow kept receiving more from followers. The setup sounded promising. Then Johnny tried to land the joke. He hesitated on the name. Bhagwan, Rajneesh, Bhagwan, Rajneesh. The punchline finally came and nothing happened. No laughter, no groans, just a flat, empty silence. You could hear someone cough in the audience. Johnny froze for a beat, looking straight ahead, not smiling, not moving on. Most hosts would rush to the next joke and pretend the moment never existed. Carson didn't. Instead, he leaned into the failure. He repeated the name again, slower this time, deliberately clumsy, as if the real joke had become his inability to say it correctly. He glanced down at his cards, then back at the audience, letting the discomfort stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it. That's when the laugh finally came, not because the joke worked, but because Johnny openly acknowledged that it didn't. The audience laughed at the shared awkwardness, at the honesty of watching a joke die in real time and not be rescued. Carson gave a small nod, reset his posture, and moved on. The room relaxed instantly. The show found its rhythm again because the silence itself had been allowed to finish the joke. It was Thanksgiving week in 1979, and Doc Severinsen was sitting in for Ed McMahon. That alone made the desk feel slightly off-familiar, but not quite right. Johnny Carson started casually, asking Doc about holiday plans, keeping the tone light and friendly. Then Doc leaned forward and asked Johnny a simple question: whether Johnny helped Mrs. Carson prepare the Thanksgiving turkey. Johnny didn't hesitate. With a confident smile, he fired back that it was just like Doc helping Mrs. Severinsen prepare the turkey. It landed as a clean, classic Carson jab, quick, masculine, and smug. The audience laughed, expecting the moment to move on. Doc didn't miss a beat. He calmly replied that there was no Mrs. Severinsen. The laugh hit instantly and harder than the first one. Johnny froze, then bent forward, reaching under the desk for tissues as the realization sank in. The punchline had flipped. What Johnny thought was a safe joke had turned into a perfect cell phone. Doc kept going, casually adding tags about divorce, checks, and Thanksgiving logistics, each one landing cleanly. Johnny tried to respond but couldn't. He was laughing too hard, completely caught by surprise. For once, the bandleader had outplayed the host, and Carson let it happen. The beauty of the moment wasn't just the joke, it was the speed. One question, one response, one reversal, and the room detonated. When Joan Embry came out on The Tonight Show, everyone knew the format. She would introduce an animal, explain a few facts, and Johnny Carson would react politely, maybe crack a gentle joke, and move on. Nothing risky, nothing chaotic. Then the bird made a sound. As Joan began explaining what kind of bird it was and where it came from, the bird suddenly let out a noise that sounded unmistakably like a human laugh. Not a chirp, not a squawk, a laugh short, sharp, and perfectly timed. The audience laughed immediately. Joan paused, smiled, and tried to continue. She didn't get far. The bird laughed again. Same sound, same timing. Johnny turned his head toward the bird, eyebrows raised, already fighting a smile. Joan attempted to stay professional, restarting her explanation as if nothing had happened. Then the bird laughed again louder, this time cutting her off mid-sentence. Now, the room lost control. Johnny leaned forward, laughing openly, no longer trying to host. Joan tried to finish a sentence, but every time she spoke, the bird interrupted with another laugh, as if it were responding directly to her. Each interruption landed harder than the last because no one could predict when it would happen. What made the moment unforgettable was that Johnny never tried to stop it. He didn't rescue Joan. He didn't redirect the segment. He simply watched, laughed, and let the chaos play out. A carefully planned animal segment had turned into a perfect comedy sketch written entirely by accident. The joke wasn't the bird. The joke was timing. When Frank Sinatra walked onto The Tonight Show, the atmosphere shifted instantly. This wasn't just a guest appearance, it was an event. The audience sat a little straighter. Johnny Carson treated Sinatra with visible respect, knowing exactly how much weight he carried in that room. Then Don Rickles did the one thing no one else would dare to do. Rickles started lightly, praising Sinatra before slipping in small jabs comments about age, hair, and how long he'd been doing this. Each insult was wrapped in admiration, but the edges were sharp. The audience laughed, then immediately looked at Sinatra's face, checking his reaction before laughing again. Sinatra didn't explode. He didn't shut it down. He smiled, measured, controlled, letting Rickles continue just far enough. Every pause felt dangerous. One step too far, and the room could freeze. Johnny sat between them like a referee, watching carefully, ready to step in if the balance tipped. Rickles kept pushing, treating Sinatra like just another guy at the table, refusing to acknowledge his untouchable status. That refusal was the joke and the risk. Sinatra's calm reactions gave Rickles permission to keep going, but never enough to get reckless. The tension was the comedy. The laughs came not just from the insults, but from the constant question hanging in the air. Is this still funny? Or is Rickles about to cross the line? He never did. And Johnny Carson made sure of it. When Buddy Hackett sat down across from Johnny Carson, the audience already knew what kind of ride this would be. Hackett had a reputation: loud, physical, shameless, the kind of comic who treated network television like a suggestion, not a rulebook. He started with divorce, not gently. He talked about marriage collapsing in exaggerated, personal terms, pacing his words so the audience could feel where the story might go. Johnny leaned back slightly, listening closely, eyes tracking every sentence. This wasn't passive hosting. It was surveillance. Then Hackett moved into the bath story. He described climbing into a bathtub, building the image slowly, adding unnecessary details, leaning into implication instead of saying anything outright. Each sentence pushed closer to the edge without crossing it. The audience laughed, then laughed harder, not just at what was being said, but at what wasn't. Johnny stepped in just enough, a raised eyebrow, a soft interruption, a quick redirection that kept the story alive without letting it tip into something NBC would regret. Hackett adjusted instantly, swerving back into safer territory while keeping the momentum. That tension was the joke. The laughs came from watching how close Hackett could get and how carefully Carson would allow him to stay there. It wasn't about shock, it was about restraint, timing, and two professionals negotiating the line in real time. When Jonathan Winters sat down on The Tonight Show, there was no such thing as a normal interview. Winters didn't tell stories, he became them. Johnny Carson knew that the moment Winters opened his mouth, control would be optional. The story began simply. Winters explained that he had been fixing something around the house using glue when the cat wandered too close. He said it casually, almost dismissively, as if it were a minor household mishap. Then he paused just long enough and said the cat was stuck to the floor. From there, the story exploded. Winters acted out the cat meowing, his own panic, his wife entering the room, and the sudden realization that this was a disaster. His voice jumped registers, his body twisted and leaned. One moment he was himself, the next he was the cat, then his wife, then back again. The same incident kept escalating, each beat bigger than the last. Johnny Carson didn't interrupt. He didn't steer the story back. He leaned away from the desk, laughing, watching Winters turn a small accident into a full theatrical performance. No props, no setup, just pure momentum. By the end, Carson was barely holding onto his chair. The audience wasn't laughing at a punchline, they were laughing at the transformation. A dumb mistake had become a one-man comedy riot, and Johnny knew better than to stop it. In 1989, Johnny Carson introduced a simple list segment called Phrases You'll Never Hear. There was no story, no setup, no escalation warning. Johnny explained the premise once, calmly, as if reading a public notice, then began. He read the first line in the same authoritative tone he used for serious announcements. "That's Mr. Rogers to you, and stay the hell out of my neighborhood." The laugh came instantly, but Johnny didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't pause. He went straight to the next line, keeping his voice flat, neutral, almost bored. That refusal to acknowledge the laugh made the next joke hit harder. Each phrase followed the same pattern. Familiar at first, something that could exist, then a sharp turn into absurdity. The rhythm was relentless. One sentence, one beat, move on, no explanation, no commentary. Ed McMahon did the opposite. He laughed loudly, openly, reacting like a member of the audience who couldn't hold it in. That contrast was the engine of the bit. Johnny stayed stone-faced. Ed exploded. The audience followed Ed. By the end, the room wasn't laughing at individual jokes anymore. They were laughing at the precision, at the confidence of a host who knew that doing less would always get more. When Louis Anderson walked onto the Tonight Show stage, there was no instant recognition, no roar, just polite applause. He didn't look like a star. He sounded nervous, soft-spoken, almost apologetic, exactly the opposite of the loud comics who usually dominated late night. Louis started small. He talked about his family, about discomfort, about the kind of everyday awkwardness most people recognize but rarely admit out loud. The jokes weren't fast. They unfolded slowly, deliberately, letting the audience get comfortable with him before asking for big laughs. You could feel the shift. The crowd stopped evaluating and started listening. Each laugh made him a little more confident. Each pause felt earned instead of awkward. Johnny Carson leaned forward, watching closely. This was the pattern he'd seen hundreds of times, a comic finding his footing in real time. By the end of the set, the applause wasn't polite anymore. It was warm, sustained. Johnny nodded, smiled, and welcomed him back to the couch, the quiet signal every comedian understood. You didn't just survive your first Tonight Show appearance. You belonged. That nod meant something. Careers were launched in moments like this, not with explosions, but with trust. When Emmanuel Lewis walked onto the Tonight Show stage, the reaction came instantly. He was small, young, already familiar from television, the kind of guest most hosts would automatically handle with gentle jokes and obvious cute setups. Johnny Carson didn't do that. Johnny greeted Emmanuel the same way he greeted every adult guest. Same tone, same pace, same expectations. That choice changed everything. Emmanuel answered quickly, confidently, without looking to Johnny for help or approval. When Johnny teased him lightly, Emmanuel fired back without hesitation. No long pauses, no nervous laughs, just clean, direct responses that landed on time. The audience didn't laugh because he was a kid. They laughed because the rhythm worked. You could see Carson recalibrating in real time. He wasn't carrying the segment, he was reacting to it. Each exchange felt like a real conversation, not a staged bit designed to manufacture awe moments. Emmanuel wasn't being protected by the format, he was keeping up with it. That's why the segment stayed memorable. It wasn't about novelty, it was about chemistry. A young guest who didn't need to be guided and a host smart enough to recognize it and step back. Johnny barely did anything, and that was the point. When Carey stepped onto the Tonight Show stage, there was nothing flashy about him. No big personality entrance, no sharp suit. He looked like a regular guy who had wandered onto television by accident. That was the point. Started with simple observations, everyday frustrations, normal life problems, the kind of material that didn't feel written in a room full of writers. The jokes came steadily, not rushed. Each laugh made him a little more comfortable, a little looser. You could feel the audience deciding, in real time, that they liked this guy. Johnny Carson watched closely. This was familiar territory for him. He had seen this pattern before, a comedian not overpowering the room, but earning it. By the time Drew reached the final beats of his set, the laughter was confident and consistent. When it was over, Johnny gave him that look, the nod every stand-up recognized. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it said everything. You'll be back. That moment mattered. The Tonight Show wasn't just a stage, it was a gate, and Carey had just walked through it. What made Johnny Carson special was never just the jokes, it was his instincts, his ability to sense when to step in, when to step back, and when to let chaos breathe. These funniest moments weren't scripted highlights, they were collisions between preparation and unpredictability. Whether it was Don Rickles pushing boundaries, Jonathan Winters detonating a story into madness, or a nervous newcomer quietly earning the room, Carson treated every moment the same way, with trust. He trusted the guest. He trusted the audience. And most importantly, he trusted timing. That's why these clips still work decades later. They aren't tied to headlines or trends. They're built on rhythm, restraint, and human reaction. A look, a pause, a laugh that goes too far, a joke that bombs and the grace to acknowledge it. Late-night television has changed, but these moments remain untouched because they weren't manufactured. They happened live, once, and were never repeated the same way again. That's the magic people still feel when they watch Carson today. And that's why, all these years later, we're still laughing,